Hello everyone. This is Mr. Vanderpool, and over the past couple of weeks here, we've learned about aggregate demand, we've learned about short-run aggregate supply, and we've learned about long-run aggregate supply. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put all three of these graphs together into what's called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And this is a model that is going to be used a lot in this class. There is no other graph that is used more often in AP macroeconomics than the ADAS, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And today we're really going to be focusing in on the shifting of aggregate demand in this ADAS model. Alright, so the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is going to look something like this. On your y-axis, you're going to have price level represented by the variable PL. On our x-axis, we're going to have real GDP represented by GDPR. You have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. You have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Then you have your vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. And remember, right below that long-run aggregate supply curve is going to be your YF, your full employment output. Okay, remember at full employment output, you have about 5% unemployment. All resources are being utilized. You are at full employment, therefore you have that 5% unemployment. So this long-run aggregate supply and that full employment output is very rarely going to move. Okay, so the equilibrium of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, particularly short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, is going to determine the current output, represented by real GDP or GDPR, and the price level, represented by the variable PL. So you can see there it was where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersected that you had an equilibrium price level, represented by the variable P, and you're at full employment output, which is YF. And the only reason that happened is because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersected at long-run aggregate supply, which we're going to talk about more in a few minutes. But this type of model that you're looking at here is called the new classical ADAS model. There are other types of models which we will look at in this class, but more than anything we're going to look at what's called the new classical ADAS model. Alright, so ladies and gents, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model can really start in one of three places depending upon where your economy is at. And we're going to start off with full employment. Now this is where you want the economy to be. This is the goal for economists. So full employment equilibrium exists where aggregate demand intersects long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply at the same point. So the ADAS that you saw in the previous slide was in full employment. Okay? So here, once again, you have price level on your y-axis, real GDP on your x-axis. You've got your long-run aggregate supply curve with your full employment output below the long-run aggregate supply curve. And the key thing here is aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are intersecting at full employment output, at the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay? So when this happens, you are at full employment, okay? And remember when you're at YF, when you're at full employment, that you have all resources are being utilized, you're at full employment, which is about 5% unemployment, you're fully efficient, etc. So the goal for an economy is for aggregate demand and short aggregate supply to be intersecting at YF, at full employment output, which occurs below that long-run aggregate supply curve. So you can see here aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, they intersected at the long-run aggregate supply curve, which gave you an equilibrium price level represented by the variable P, and you are currently here at full employment output, which is represented by the variable YF. Now, let's look at some economic problems in graphical form. So we have a recessionary gap. If an economy is in recession, you'll have what's called a recessionary gap. And so a recessionary gap is going to exist when equilibrium occurs below full employment output. So you can look at this graph, and price levels on the y-axis, real GDP is on the x-axis, and aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are intersecting before full employment output. So where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect, you can see you have an equilibrium price level represented by the variable P and output represented by the variable Y. And notice your output at this point is not quite up to full employment output. You're not producing as much as you possibly could. At this point, chances are the unemployment rate in the economy is going to be higher, okay, because there's less output. There's less real gross domestic product. Okay, that means there's going to be less hiring, which means that you're going to have a higher unemployment rate. Okay, so recessionary gap, aggregate demand, short aggregate supply intersect before full employment output. Unemployment rate's going to be high, and output isn't quite up to where it should be. Now, another problem you can have in an economy is you can have inflation. And if you have inflation, you're going to have what's called an inflationary gap. So an inflationary gap is going to exist when equilibrium occurs beyond the full employment output. So if we look at this ADAS graph, you can see that aggregate demand and short aggregate supply are intersecting beyond full employment output. Okay, output is beyond your Y here, because if you look at where aggregate demand and short aggregate supply intersect, you can see we have an equilibrium price level and we have an equilibrium output. So your output, in this case Y, is beyond full employment output, and you can see the price level there as well. So in an inflationary gap, chances are that your unemployment rate is going to be lower. And that is because you can see that this economy at this point is producing quite a bit. Output is beyond full employment output. So therefore there's going to be more hiring, which means you are going to have a lower unemployment rate. In an inflationary gap, the price level is going to be going up, and so you're most likely going to have inflation as well. So when I give you guys scenarios, just be aware that you're either going to be starting off with an inflationary gap, with a recessionary gap, or you're going to be starting off with full employment output. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about changes in aggregate demand. So remember, there are 4 variables that can change aggregate demand: consumption, gross private investment, government spending, net exports. Okay, there are the 4 components of gross domestic product. When they change, it changes aggregate demand, and then you'll see various changes on your aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So let's say we have a change in consumption. If you have an increase in consumption, remember those 3 little dots means implies. That implies aggregate demand is going to shift to the right, which implies that real GDP is going to be going up, and the price level is going to be going up. And we'll see that on our graph in a moment. Now, this is going to imply that the unemployment rate is going down and the inflation rate is going up. So I'm going to give you guys a clue as far as how to figure that out. Always remember that the unemployment rate is going to be moving the opposite way of real GDP. So in this case, real GDP went up, so therefore the unemployment rate is going to go down. And the reason is, like in this case, real GDP is going up, which means that there is more output, more is being produced, which means there's more hiring, which means there's less unemployment. Okay, so if GDP is going up, the unemployment rate is going to be going down. They're going to be moving the opposite way. Price level and inflation, however, are going to be moving the same way. The price level is going up, which means that the inflation rate is going to be going up as well. The reason is the inflation rate is the rate of change in the price level. So if the price level is going up, that rate of change is going up, and so your inflation rate is going to be going up. Okay, so when real GDP went up and the price level went up, that implies that the unemployment rate is going to fall and the inflation rate is going to go up. Now, let's say we lowered consumption. That would imply that aggregate demand shifts to the left. And if you put that on a graph, you'd see that real GDP falls and the price level falls in that situation. That's going to imply that the unemployment rate is going to go up and the inflation rate is going to go down. So remember that unemployment is going to move the opposite way of real gross domestic product. So in this case, the real gross domestic product fell, which means that the unemployment rate is going to go up, and let me explain why. So real GDP fell, there's less output, which means that there's less hiring, which means that the unemployment rate is going to be going up. Okay, so the unemployment rate is going the opposite way of real GDP. You can also see that the price level fell. That is going to imply that the inflation rate is going to fall. Remember that if the inflation rate is the rate of change in the price level, so if the price level is falling, that rate of change is falling, therefore inflation is going to be going down. Okay, so when real GDP fell and the price level fell, that implied that the unemployment rate went up and the inflation rate went down. Okay, so that's just for a change in consumption. Now, the rest of them are all going to look very, very similar. So let's look at gross private investment, IG. If gross private investment goes up, that means the aggregate demand is going to be shifting to the right, which means GDPR goes up, price level goes up, which implies that the unemployment rate goes down and the inflation rate goes up. Notice that this is the same thing as that first line when consumption went up. Whenever aggregate demand shifts to the right, you're going to have real GDPR going up, price level going up, unemployment rate going down, and inflation rate going up. Then let's look at gross private investment going down. So gross private investment went down, which implies that aggregate demand shifts to the left, which implies that real GDP fell, price level fell, which implies that the unemployment rate went up and the inflation rate went down. Okay, that's pretty much the same as the second line when consumption went down. Okay, because when gross private investment goes down, that means aggregate demand is going to fall. Aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. Whenever aggregate demand shifts to the left, real GDP is going to fall, price level is going to fall, which implies that unemployment is going to go up and inflation is going to go down. So always remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the unemployment rate is going to move the opposite way of GDPR, and the inflation rate is going to move the same way as the price level. You can always keep that in mind. Okay, so you can do the same thing with government spending as well as net exports. Okay, just remember that whenever aggregate demand shifts to the right, real GDP is going up, price level is going up, unemployment rate is falling, inflation rate is going up. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, GDPR falls, price level falls, unemployment rate goes up, and the inflation rate goes down. Okay, fantastic. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next video.